This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
And welcome back to the Xcast. The truth is in here. I'm your host, Tony Black, and in this special episode, we're returning to the world of Topps comics from the mid-1990s, talking about the run of Stefan Petrucca, Charlie Adlard comics from the classic sort of X-Files era, part of a series that I'm doing with my guest, the wonderful Darren Mooney. How are you, Darren?
I'm great. I am on tops of the world right now, one might say. I don't know if I used that last time. It's been so long since we recorded.
Well, I mean, I think it's a well-weathered, all-purpose pun that maybe we should make a feature of these episodes. So, don't apologise.
Yeah, I'm working on my comics timing.
So in this episode, we're moving forward in the run of comics, and we're talking about two stories. One is a three-parter called Firebird, which we'll get to first, and the second one is a solo edition called Trepanning Opera, and these are two very, very different stories, and we'll unpick them in general, but overall, Darren, before we get into the nitty-gritty a little bit, as much more of I'd say the expert on the Topps comics runs than me, as we probably established in the previous episode, what is your general thoughts on these two issues, Firebird and Trepanning Opera?
Or these four issues that comprise two stories. I'm a huge fan of this. I think this is the point where the comic really kicks into gear. I think when we talked last time, in the first three issues of the comic, you see a lot of tension where you have Petrucca as writer and Adlard as artist, trying to figure out, how do you make an X-Files comic book? And more than that, how do you make a comic book that is tying into a television show that is on the air, where the television show is airing weekly, and obviously to prepare a comic book, you need at least a month or two of prep time, and it only comes out on a monthly basis. And also, you're dealing with the fact, as I think we discussed last time, that, in many respects, and completely understandably, the production team working on the television show doesn't necessarily want to play ball with you while you're working on a tie-in comic book, leading to situations where it will directly contradict you, or you'll have characters that you can or cannot use, or you'll have to radically amend stories that you've written at the last possible minute in order to fit in with larger plans. And I think that's a lot of the tension you see in the first three. And in particular, I think I singled out A Little Dream of Me as a point where it was this is interesting, but this is not a sustainable model for the comic, and it really seems like the comic kind of figures that out. Because, whatever about the actual content of the two stories, and whatever about, the stories they're telling, I think how they're telling them is very, very comic booky. And it's very interesting that, if you look at something like Firebird, without getting too specific, you see a lot of indicators of, where the show will go in the years ahead. You see things obviously, the Tunguska incident, for example. You see an alien feasting on nuclear power, for example. Even with this being published, and again, this would have been published, I think, in the 4th, 5th, and 6th issues of the comic, which would have been starting, I believe, sometime around April 1995. So it actually beat the show to the punch in terms of setting an X-Files story in New Mexico. That's the kind of thing that you see even in Trepanning Opera. You see things like Trepanning, which comes back, and certain elements there that play out in even Millennium or Chip Johansson's script for Orison. So you see a lot of stuff there that is very this is in the show's wheelhouse. But you also see the comics doing things that really only comic books can do, or comic books can do feasibly or reasonably while still working as a narrative medium. You see a lot of blockbuster scale here in a way that the show wasn't necessarily ready to deliver in the second season, where Firebird goes from Siberia to New Mexico, and where Trepanning Opera has all these psychedelic flashback sequences happening within it. You see Adlard as an artist becoming a lot more comfortable with his work and a lot more comfortable with terms of comic book pacing. You see a lot of stuff that looks very much like the kind of widescreen storytelling that will become very popular in comics towards the end of the decade, where you'll see pages laid out with horizontal or vertical panels that are essentially the same space, showing the passage of time through them, which is a really good comic book storytelling trope or trick. And you also see, I think, in terms of writing, you see Petrucca really leaning into the influence of a lot of, say, the British invasion that was very popular in American comic books around this time in the early 90s. Last time we talked about the market, and we talked about like the idea of why you ended up with an X-Files comic book published by a baseball card company. But it's also notable that like American comics was going through a cultural revolution at the time, where due to the success of, say, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons on Watchmen, DC had gone over to the UK and done a massive recruitment drive and brought in all these writers, including, for example, like Grant Morrison, Neil Gaiman, Garth Ennis, the disgraced Warren Ellis, Peter Milligan, all these sorts of people from the UK who had very strong, very distinctive voices, and brought them over to write comics that were, you know, aimed at a slightly older audience, towards teenagers, perhaps even towards adults. You saw the establishment of, say, the Vertigo brand at DC, and you saw this kind of like emergence of comic books that were aimed at readers that were perhaps a bit more sophisticated, a bit more existential. If you want to be a bit more cynical, the kind of readers who were sitting in dorm rooms smoking bongs in the early 90s, but the kind of readers who were perhaps more interested in like existential philosophical questions than they would have been reading comics in the 60s or the 70s. And you see a lot of that shine through in terms of the writing here, and we'll talk about the particulars of it kind of, you know, when we get to the two stories we're talking about. But you see Petrucca beginning to really seed questions that he'd hinted at in like A Disremembrance of Things Past and even A Little Dream of Me, but really pushing them to the fore, where even in Firebird, which is this big, bombastic, myth arc-esque kind of epic sweeping 3-part story, you still get a whole question. You have moments where characters literally ask, you know, well, we could be what we appear to be. We could also be a bunch of strangers who've been hypnotized to be convinced that we are who we think we are. We could also be a dream, an illusion, an hallucination. We could just be one conspiracy of many. And it's like, this is not at all useful information. This isn't not tying anything down, but it ties into the themes that Petrucca is dealing with, which is this idea of like questioning reality, which is a very existential, abstract idea to be dealing in, you know, when you're publishing what is essentially a tie-in supplementary comic book. So that's kind of like, I do think that you see all of this beginning to click into place with these kind of 3 issues or these 4 issues in the middle of the run. And I think that while I have misgivings about like Trepanning Opera in particular, I think that like the comic has kind of really settled down and really found its voice and is in a really, really good place. This is essentially the middle act of what will be an opening, I believe it's roughly 13 issue run that covers the first year of the comic's life. So this is Act 2, and you can already feel the sense that, okay, well, Petrucca and Adlard, despite having a somewhat rough start figuring out how they were going to do this thing, have settled into a rhythm that is actually working for them. So I really like these 4 issues taken as a whole, and kind of where the comic finds itself at this moment in time.
Yeah, it's in a really interesting place. I think what struck me with, I mean, they're 2 very different stories, is what we'll come to, but what struck me was how, like you said, how much it predates what we know to be the mythology of the X-Files. It gives a completely sort of in-step but alternate kind of approach to some of these ideas that we see later on in the show. That really stuck out with me in Firebird. And then with Trepanning Opera, it's such a strange story. And this is something we came at a little bit with the previous 2. You know, in the way they are a bit of a mind trip, and it to a degree that you don't always get, and you don't get that in the later, more modern X-Files comics. It's a different kind of approach in many ways, and I think some of the ideas in play in these 2 stories are fantastic. They're vivid, and they're the kind of things that I think you're so right about it being particularly comic-y. There are certain things, I mean, particularly in Firebird, well, if you think about the alien in Firebird, there's no way they were going to do that on television. So, you know, that's
it looks like something from a 50s B movie, which like it looks, it's 10, like, again, listeners, I recommend that you read these comics. I don't know if Tony will, but I'd say that, like, even just look up pictures of Firebird. It looks like something from a 1950s creature feature, which is something that really, you know, wouldn't work in live action. You know, arguably even today you'd have to be doing something heightened like Lovecraft Country to get it to work, whereas in comic books it kind of just feels right. I think I would argue, sorry?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I think on one of the issues of Firebird, there's a Lovecraft quote, isn't there? I think from the Call of Cthulhu. So it's very, It's very much in that wheelhouse, in that Lovecraftian wheelhouse that you'd never have been able to convey on screen with the X-Files and it actually work particularly. Not on that scale, anyway. There are obviously certain Lovecraftian ideas that bleed through into the X-Files, given they bled through into Stephen King and he's a massive formative, all these things. But on that scale, so the comics are already doing something different to the show, and that helps them stand out, I think, even with the distance we have now.
Oh yeah, no, and I mean that's the thing, is that I think if you look at the comics, like, again, I don't want to get into a comparing and contrasting which is better or worse when you look at like the modern comics and these early comics. But I think that, like, when you look at modern comics, a lot of modern comics are folded around the idea of continuity and canon and the idea of mattering. Like when season 10 came out, it was very much like, oh, this is officially the continuation of the X-Files with Chris Carter acting as Godfather. That was like a big deal, a huge part of the announcement of the publication under IDW. Now, of course, that very quickly turned out not to be the case as soon as Fox said, actually, would you like to bring it back to television? But there was this sense, like, looking at the continuation of the comics, that it was like, oh, this is an official continuation of the show. It is the show just in a different form. It's that, again, I don't want to, I like a lot of those comics and everything like that. I'm not dismissing or belittling them. But there is that sense of, like, seeing comic books as a medium, and again, this is something that largely creeps in around when you get to the late 90s, early 2000s, thanks to the work of people like, say, again, Warren Ellis and Brian Hitch, Mark Millar, and all these other people, where you start seeing comic books positioned as almost storyboards for feature film adaptation. Like, there's a reason why Hollywood is constantly greenlighting, say, Mark Millar adaptations, and that's because Millar's comic books often feel like they're just, again, like watching kind of like screen maps, screen grabs, kind of like storyboards for making a feature film adaptation of it. Whereas, and like, you see a lot of emphasis in terms of likeness. And again, even in this run that we're talking about now with Topps, when we get towards the end of Petrucca and Adlard's run, you'll see that the publisher starts pushing for more likeness, more fidelity, more resemblance to the text itself, more resemblance to the show. Whereas, and like even in the gap between, I think it's the DC imprint Wildstorm have the rights to the X-Files comics between Topps and between IDW. And if you look at their comics under Wildstorm, you have that push of like, well, we hired Frank Spotnitz, and Frank Spotnitz is one of the writers of the show, therefore the comic is an extension of the show. We're just doing a TV episode, but it's in a comic book. And I think what I really like about these comics in particular is that they don't feel like they are the show in a comic book. They feel like they're the comic book version of the show. They're using the conventions, the language, the rhythms, and even like the genre expectations of the comic book. Like if you look at the themes of these issues, and we'll get into them in a moment, but the themes involve things like, what is reality? Like, what is existence? Is your perception of reality indistinguishable from reality? Is there a distinction there, and does it matter? Things like, and like there's a wonderful moment in, I believe it's Trepanning Opera, where Mulder goes to his apartment after meeting to kind of communicate with his source, and he finds on the locker a piece of paper with a musical note written on it. Which is, I believe it's E flat, and it's to point to like one of the flats on E Street or whatever, which is a very elaborate message that could very easily be misunderstood, but I kind of admire it. But even that is something that's drawing attention to the form of comic books, because comic books are a medium that exists without sound. So having Mulder go into his room and pick up a piece of paper with a musical note on it symbolizing music or sound in a medium that has no sound or music in it is very much playing with the understanding that you are reading this in a comic book. You're not watching a TV show or watching a movie. And again, that's very similar to a lot of stuff that was happening with, again, those kind of writers and artists we mentioned that were coming up in the early 90s. People like Grant Morrison, where like Grant Morrison, they will continually in their scripts have characters like whistle, or they'll have them play music that breaks people's hearts, or music that can like unlock weapons or can defeat evil. And the whole joke is that, well, you're reading a comic book, it's a medium without any sound whatsoever, so it's kind of funny and self-aware for a writer to make music essential to that. And like that's where this is operating, and I think that's what I really like about it, is that it doesn't feel like it's a TV show that has been adapted into a comic book so much as it's a comic book that is running in parallel with the TV show. It's taking some of the core ideas of the show and it's adapting them in a way that is that plays the strengths of the medium as a whole. I mean, again, there's several sequences in this where like Mulder hijacks cars and like drives them through like armies and all this sort of stuff. Where like the creature threatens to feed on like New Mexico's kind of cityscape and all this sort of stuff that will be impossible to realize even when the show reaches the kind of the peak of its powers in seasons 4 through 6 or whatever. There's no way that you were going to get this sense of storytelling, but it costs as much to ask Charles Adlard to draw, a close-up of Scully's face as it does to ask him to draw a giant pink tentacled monster with a gaping yellow eye about to devour an entire cityscape beneath it. So why not? Why not do that thing? And like that's something that I do really admire about this. And I understand that might be a cause of friction. I'm curious, as this is your first time reading through, how are you finding these?
I'm really enjoying them. I am. I'm finding them to be... Yeah, I think we talked last time about how the characterization isn't necessarily always dead on. Maybe more so for Scully. But I think it's pretty close. And I think the ideas in these stories are deliberately heightened, deliberately strange, deliberately trippy. I can't in a way see these stories being adapted on screen in quite the same way, and I think that's a real testament to these comics. It's not that they're, like you said earlier, it's not that they're any better or worse at all. But they are almost a little bit like they're from a parallel universe X-Files. A little bit like a little bit how the season 10, 11 later are essentially retconned into being an alternate universe. These also feel like they are. They're from a universe where Mulder and Scully will encounter these more overtly referential homages to 50s B movies, to Lovecraft, to all of these elements in the way that the show would never have done. So I think I love it for that. I think it's great. It's colourful. It's vivid. It's brilliantly drawn, and just the lyricism of Petrucca's writing is fantastic. It complements, I think, the kind of things that Chris Carter was doing on screen really well. So no, I'm having a blast. It's great coming at these from the first time around.
No, I'm glad to hear that. I was kind of nervous that it's going to be like, this is just going to be Darren ranting about how much he loves these comics, and Tony's like, oh no, I have to do this next year as well.
No, I genuinely, I'm having a lot of fun. So let's dig in a little bit then on each one of these. So Firebird is three issues. You were right to correct me earlier. Two distinct stories, but 4 issues, and there's 3 issues of Firebird, and we've talked a little bit about it, but I think obviously it starts, and this is another example of how it was operating separate from what would become X-Files canon, but it starts with the Tunguska incident, which obviously then in season 4 of the X-Files, a little bit later, becomes entangled within the alien myth arc. But this is a very different version of Tunguska, and it creates something even stranger than what we actually end up getting the Tunguska incident related to in the show. So I already, these comics are drawing on the kind of things that Carter and his team drew on the TV show, drawing on real life mysteries, real life strange events in order to tell these stories.
Yeah, but coming at them in a kind of a very different way. And like, it's worth noting, just again, very boring, but in terms of structure, I love that, like, it has the X-Files cold open. Like, it's not until, I think, 5 pages into the story that you see Scully. It has this entire different opening, which is things happening to strangers, terrible things happening, and then you cut to the X-Files office. You can almost, like, position where the opening credits would go if this were an episode of television, which I think is kind of really nice and kind of really clever and a nice structural nod to the show, which is great as well. But yeah, like again, you get the sense that there's a lot of stuff just in the air, and Petrucca kind of just gets to beat Carter to it by virtue of the fact that this was coming out during the 2nd season when the show didn't really have the budget to do this sort of stuff. And again, like, he only manages to beat it by a couple of months when you get to, like, New Mexico, where, like, obviously Petrucca's done the maths. He's done the same maths paths that Carter has at this point in the show's run, which is to understand that Vancouver can be anywhere in the world. It can be Russia, it can be, forest, it can be urban landscape, it can be Seattle, it can be whatever you need it to be, but it can't duplicate the American Southwest. That is an impossible ask. And if you were to set an X-File in New Mexico, in the second season while you're shooting in Vancouver, you'd have to do something crazy like paint every rock in a quarry red. But nobody
I knew you were
would do
say
anything that crazy, right? But
I love that.
So he manages to get there just ahead. Literally just inches ahead of Anasazi doing exactly the same thing. And I love that it's you can tell that it's he's in step. It's not, as you point out, there are differences in tone, in imagery, in pacing, in rhythm and structure from the show itself. But you can also tell that Petrocca was very much on the same wavelength, just abstractly, as the writing team, because he's obviously drawing from the same pool of ideas, which again is something I admire, because as you said, it's like a parallel universe. It's like an alternate version of the X-Files, where Tunguska is a giant squid monster.
It sounds ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous saying it, but it works in a very lyrical way, tethered to a Tunguska resident called Kobka, and the first issue is subtitled Kobka's Lament. But it weaves in Native American mysticism and the idea of fox Mulder being a spirit animal, and then weaves in the conspiracies in terms of strange trucks driving through the desert and hazmat teams and secret nuclear bases. And there's so much going on here being brewed up into real mix, but you feel all of these different strands don't seem to work against each other. It all just seemed to flow really well in this story.
Yeah, and again, this is the kind of thing where it being a comic book really works. You mentioned the spirit animal of the fox, and again, this is not a particularly subtle issue. You have a character, a minor side character, a Native American character called literally Walks with Foxes. In case you don't get that this is a story that's metaphorically about Fox Mulder. But you also have the recurring motif of the desert fox, which keeps popping up. It causes the car crash that leads Mulder and Scully to the investigation. It's drinking from the water when Mulder pulls himself out of the river. Later on, it's sniffing around and has to be kicked away by one of the surveillance. Yeah.
The Desert Fox Motel as well.
Yeah.
The motel is called the Desert Fox.
In case you don't get the theme that we're hammering here. And I really love that kind of closing page of the fox staring at the sky, seeing the alien disappear, and then just pottering on its way, as if having no real understanding of what has happened whatsoever, and disappearing into the night. And you say all that, and if people haven't read the comic books, they're going, this must be the most pretentious load of nonsense ever, where there's a subplot about a random desert fox in New Mexico. But it's no, it works really well, because it's kind of heightened comic booky storytelling where everything is kind of symbolic and abstract. And again, Carter does a lot of this on the show as well. We've talked about Carter's kind of purple prose in the sense in which the show can occasionally get a little heavy-handed in its symbolism. But I really love that about Firebird, where Petrocca and then he has Scully holding a skull. Scully holding a skull, making a Yorick.
It's a great
joke.
image.
And it's I admire how you're leaning into this. It's this is, again, it's the kind of thing that you'd be wary of doing today, and you probably couldn't do on television because it would seem pretentious or it would seem clumsy. But in comics, where everything is heightened, where storytelling is more compressed because you have only so much space to do it and you have to communicate clearly visually what is going on, I really like how direct this story is with its imagery, its symbolism, and kind of the iconography that it keeps playing off. Again, without ever feeling pretentious, because this is very much, it's a chase adventure movie with a giant purple squid that is possibly going to devour every living creature in the state of New Mexico. So it's not as if it's particularly pretentious or has what we would call notions in Ireland, but it is still constructed in a way where you have this imagery that reinforces its themes and ideas, and arguably makes the story make sense as much as the exposition dialogue, where Mulder is the fox. Mulder is this force that just wanders through the universe and like derails the plans of great men and causes and creates these huge messes that inadvertently lead to disaster, and yet somehow manages to stumble blindly off into the night, no better or perhaps even no wiser for the experience that he has just endured. And again, you have it again. Like, again, it's Petrucca, who is I believe he's a novelist originally, and you can kind of feel that in terms of his writing, where even if, like, say, some plot details maybe get a little bit hazy at certain points where characters materialize out of nowhere and happen to be exactly where they need to be because of the rules of expedient storytelling, but you have this thing where, like, that incident with the fox, where within 4 pages of the comic, the fox has caused a car crash that sets in motion effectively the plot of the rest of the story that we're going to tell. That is, like, effectively a metaphor for, obviously, both Fox Mulder, where there's this sense of, like, this question of, like, where his quest is going to go, if his quest is going to get people hurt, if his quest is going to have unintended consequences that cause harm beyond his ability to comprehend. But that also ties into what turns out to be Kubka's main arc, which is this idea that he took something not understanding what it was, and it ended up causing this chain reaction that led to things getting out of control and caused a massive amount of harm that he never could have planned or anticipated for. And so, like, you have that theme echoing through, like, the various levels of this story, which is, again, about a giant squid monster with a big yellow eye. And I love that. I like it. You could say it's pretentious, you could say it's insistent, but I love that it's so deliberate in what it's doing.
Yeah, no, it is. Yeah, with a wink, and you know, a smile. I mean, there are again some really good examples of humour, you know, in this. Like, one of my favourites is when I think it's part 2 when they've looked upon the great giant squid, and Scully says, "Mulder, what is that thing?" And he says, "Well, either it's a deep space entity with cold fusion biology that took a wrong turn at Tunguska in 1908, or the lost episodes of Jacques Cousteau are a lot more exciting than anyone guessed." I think it's great. That's great. Yeah, that is pure Mulder.
Yeah, like, and it doesn't have any notions or any kind of goof. Like, I kind of, and again, this probably gets at something we probably talked a little bit about Scully, because I think you mentioned, like, the challenges in writing Scully in the sense in which this is a comic that is kind of like that. I think, like, if you're gonna criticize the characterization, I think Petrucca's Mulder is quite good. I think his Scully is perhaps a bit rough around the edges. And I think there are several reasons for that, and a lot of them are down to, like, the time and the place where this comic was published, where when Petrucca was writing this, like, it would have been the start of the second season, where Scully is, like, first of all, marginalized, where she's separated from Mulder, and then entirely absent. So, like, you get a sense that, like, Mulder is the guiding force of the X-Files in that, like, early second season run, and you can almost kind of see Petrucca leaning into that. And the other side, and this is something where I'm a bit more generous towards it, and you see it both, it comes across really well in Firebird, and it also comes across in Trepanning Opera, but it's this idea of, you can see Petrucca having to conceptually deal with the character of Scully in a story where he has, like, again, a giant yellow-eyed tentacled monster that is, like, consuming radiation, where he has to deal with that question that the show is eventually going to have to deal with, like, later on as things escalate and accelerate and grow across the run of the series, where Scully is going to see these things, but is still going to have to function as the skeptic. And the show, to be fair, the show runs into bother with that. Like, that's a kind of a problem from the 4th season on, particularly from the 6th season. And, like, I think that you get a really good, again, when you talk about the comics prefiguring the show, there's a really nice moment in Firebird where Mulder is, like, you know, dealing with his own stuff and Scully is trying to find him. And she basically says, what would Mulder do in this situation? He would guess with certainty. That is what he would do. And that feels very much like it kind of prefigures, like, Scully in, like, you know, 8 season episodes. Like, yeah, what's the one? The Butt Genie episode? Damn it, I forget its name. Badla. Like Badla. Where it's like Scully is trying to figure out how to, where he's trying to figure out how to be Mulder, and that's kind of part of it. But in terms of characterization, you can see that, like, Petrucca has to reverse engineer Scully, where he knows that at the end of the day, she has to be the skeptic. Like, he, as a comic book writer, cannot give Scully an experience that changes her perception of the universe, because if that's going to happen, it's going to happen in the show, it's not going to happen in a comic book. so he has to work backwards. And I like as an exercise in writing, as a conceptual approach to the character, I admire it. He says, okay, what if Scully's skepticism isn't results-oriented? What if Scully's questioning and skepticism isn't about what happens at the end or what she's physically seen or what she's presented with? What if it is instead a philosophical approach that differentiates herself from Mulder? There's a really good monologue, I think it's at the start of part 2, where she talks about like the difference between herself and Mulder, where Mulder...
Yeah, I love that.
And she's like, again, she's right about Mulder. Like, Petrucca is very on the money with how the show is constructed. Mulder starts at an answer and then works backwards to get the question. That's typically how Mulder like solves all his cases.
Yeah.
And so Petrucca comes up with the idea of Scully then has to be methodical. Scully's skepticism is rooted in her methodology. It's rooted in her way of looking at the universe. So it doesn't matter what you put in front of her. She is always going to apply the scientific method to try and understand it. She has to believe that there is a rational explanation for it, rather than operating as Mulder does from, well, it's obviously a giant squid monster from Tunguska that feeds on radiation. I mean, what else is it gonna be? So I kind of... I agree with you. I agree with you, and I agree with anybody who makes the point that like his Scully is quite different from the Scully who develops on the show. But I also understand, I think, maybe why that is, like, just looking at where the comic is. And I think the solution that he has to that problem is, if not elegant, at least intelligent, I think.
Yeah, I think, I agree. I suppose it's that whole, it blends the mystic and the extraterrestrial in a way that the show, and Native American mysticism and all these kind of things, in a way that the show will go on and do. It's maybe a little bit more overt. It's a little bit more B-movie, you know, if I'm honest. You've got the Men in Black. You've literally got Mr. Black in this story. I'm in this story.
Mr. Blue, yeah.
Mr. Blue, yeah.
Mr. Black, Mr. Blue,
yeah. You've got the Reservoir Dogs showing up, you know, but they're the classic kind of, you know, Men in Black as such. And you have the like we say, the B-movie affectations of the nuclear power and the desert and... You know, the almost
bodies
laughable
turning to skeletons, like, repeatedly?
Yeah, exactly. And almost the laughable sort of cosmic horror nature and of the thing. And then a cabal of, you know, very sinister men, you know, army men. You know.
Operating Project Aquarius, which I really love as well.
Yeah, which is really cool. I love the end of part 2, where he's like, "Congratulations, Agent Mulder, you finally found us. You found the secret rulers of the world." Because
at our little horseshoe-shaped table.
Yeah. It felt, in a way, it reminded me weirdly of The Truth, and the end of, you know, the episode The Truth, where he's sort of on trial in front of this cabal of, you know, it's almost like a little bit of a forerunner of that, I guess. But it's a more, I suppose it's a more traditional
5 issues into the monthly comic.
Yeah, and he's
like, I love that you're like, so this is where the show's going to arrive at 10 years. It's like 5 issues in.
Yeah, exactly. But I really like how it's the kind of explanation for the secret people behind all of this conspiracy that you would expect, almost. You know, these sinister military figures holding skulls with lots of like TVs in the background controlling the world. It's a very different idea to the very almost anonymous syndicate sitting in a little office in New York, you know, pulling those strings, which is more subtle. But I love the way this just goes for that mad conspiratorial idea here.
And to be fair, I do love how the character, who I'm not even sure gets a name, like, seems to love being a comic book supervillain. Where, like, he doesn't just have a bank of TVs. He's posing in front of them with a skull, throwing the skull into the air and catching it mid-monologue. Again, like, there's a real sense of kind of like Petrucca playing with the expectations of the genre, where that is very clearly meant to be like Ozymandias at the climax of Watchmen, where you have the big screen and you have the big monologue that explains everything that you know we're doing and why you cannot stop us even if you were to try. So I might as well indulge in this. Like, I think General Schadenfreude is one of the characters here, to give an example. But like,
I love that. I love that so much.
I love that, like, General Schadenfreude, I believe, dies at the end of the story, and the guy is just like, well, he never liked him anyway. But like, one of the things that I do really love about it is that you get that sense of, again, Petrucca being, like, almost playful and kind of cheeky, where... Like, we talked about with A Little Dream of Me, where, like, he was playing with the cigarette-smoking man, and he was playing with, like, Samantha Mulder. He was playing with toys that belonged to the TV show, and he was never going to get to actually hold or do anything with, because they would always have to reset to factory settings, and to be honest, he had no idea what the show was going to do with them next week or next month, so he couldn't actually do anything particularly insightful or interesting with them. And I love that, like, it seems like his response from that experience has been, fine, I'll create my own conspiracy with blackjack and hookers. And then to fold that into, like, the grander themes of his run, where, like, he is obviously aware, as, like, any reader reading this comic book is, which is that, like, you point out Mulder is literally dragged kicking and screaming into the room with the vast conspiracy in it, and, like, basically told, hey, say hello. We're the guys you've been looking for your entire life. And then almost immediately on the first page of, like, the final issue, you have Petrucca going, well, you as a reader know, and I as a writer know, this cannot actually be that, because that is going to happen on the show someday. As you point out, it will take another, like, 8 years at this point for the show to actually get there, but it will get there eventually. So you have Petrucca say, well, okay, what if we instead suggest that this is something, like, and again, this is something that, where I'm wary of being the guy who goes off on a tangent and listeners rolling their eyes. But this is the kind of thing that I love about, say, the second season of Millennium, where, like, the X-Files mythology is fascinating and it's clever and it's brilliant and I absolutely adore it. I love it to pieces. But it doesn't capture, like, the sheer level of insanity and contradiction that you get in real-life conspiracy theories, where, you know, all these elements that are mutually exclusive need to coexist for these conspiracy theories to, like, operate with one another, where, you know, the Illuminati need to both be completely able to control the world, but also completely inept at preventing people from finding out that they exist, where, you know, 9/11 needs to be both an inside job and the work of a secret cabal, and these elements which are, you know, mutually exclusive and irreconcilable to one another, but are somehow part of the same fabric of conspiracy theory that has kind of taken root. And I really love that Petrucca takes advantage of the fact that, like, he's never going to get to give the definitive answer to the X-Files, and instead, like, positions it as one of many possible answers that exists both in direct contradiction to, but also in relationship with, the answer that Mulder will eventually get. Where, like, Mulder shows up and you have, like, the second and third panel of the, like, third issue here, where he's like, you know, I'm not sure what proper form of address is for a cabal that rules the world. You have, like, the guy say, now, nothing's certain. Let's just say that we like to think we control the world. We could, after all, be actors, hypnotized into believing we are who we say we are. Or just one of a dozen groups, each believing they're the one in power, when no one truly is. That's the problem with conspiracies. They have a tendency to divide, multiply, and then vanish. Point of fact, Mulder, we might even be a dream. No matter what you think you see, there is no proof. And so, Petrucca manages what is, to me, a really deft, really clever, and, you know, I'm going to be honest, I suspect to some readers, really self-important, pretentious, and downright trollish way of dealing with the fact that he's never going to get to write the actual X-Files conspiracy by saying, what if there are lots of conspiracies? And what if there is no one central conspiracy? And what if there is no truth? What if there are all these contradictions that we can't reconcile to one another? And again, that kind of reminds me a lot of the second season of Millennium, as I mentioned, where you have things like, say, the owls and the roosters, and you have, like, the Nazis, and you have all this stuff that's happening and all this stuff that's going on, where you have these different groups with different aims who seem to overlap and intersect with one another, where I think, like, it's implied in the second season finale of Millennium that, like, the cigarette smoking cigarette-smoking man is also a member of the Millennium Group, which is presumably working at odds with the conspiracy in the X-Files, even though the two of them believe completely different things, and they both can't be true about what the end of the world will look like. And I like that, like, Firebird just, like, goes straight there, where it's like, look, nothing is real. No, you cannot believe anything. If you say trust no one, that means also not trusting the answer that you find when you believe the truth is out there. And how do you reconcile these two things with one another? And I absolutely, like, again, it's something that Petrucca keeps coming back to across the run. And in particular, like, the finale of the year-long arc that opens it, but it plays out, I think, across the remaining 4 issues that he does as well. And I think it's something that I really adore about these comics, because, as you said, it's something that is very heightened. I'm not sure the show could do something like this without alienating, like, 3/4 of its audience. So I kind of admire that, like, the 6th issue of the tie-in comic book published by the Baseball Card Company is like, yep, we're going there. I love it. I love it so much.
Me too. Absolutely. For all these reasons you described. And it's in the best traditions of the X-Files, you know, throwing it up there, letting you question, leaving it open, suggesting that there is all kinds of different conspiracies, all kinds of different mysteries going on, and you don't quite know. You know, nothing about this alien being has any seeming connection, really, to anything else we've seen in the mythology, except the fact maybe he likes nuclear power. So, you know, you could... But that's the point. I mean, we love drawing connections, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, Darren, particularly with Star Trek lately. But, like, we love drawing connections. We love connecting things up. And one of the great things about the X-Files is that the point is that we're not supposed to. You know, we're not necessarily supposed to make everything work, because it's a chaotic universe. And to be honest, the X-Files was maybe at its best when you did have these different weird elements going on. You would have an episode like Fallen Angel, where you had like a predatory invisible alien running through beams, and then you would have the alien clones with green blood, and then you get the alien bounty hunter turn up, and all of this weird... And it didn't seem to make any sense. It didn't seem to be part of the same thing. In a way, it was creepier and it was scarier, and it was more chaotic. And I, if anything, I love that a little bit more than when it is all part of a grand scheme that he's supposedly fitting together. And Firebird is a great example of something that just goes, let's just have fun with this. Let's just go for it, you know? And that is great. That is great. There's room for both. Don't get me wrong. I'm not having a go at the mythology in that sense, but there is some joy to be had with a story like this, for sure. Absolutely.
Oh yeah, I mean, like, as you said, like, the appeal of conspiracy theories is that they make sense of a world that is inherently chaotic and arbitrary and random. And so it's kind of fun to then, like, double down and argue that, like, well, if that's the case, you need to deal with the fact that many of these conspiracies don't make sense with each other or even within themselves, and just make the world more chaotic and absurd and scary and irrational, which is kind of, like, it's brilliant. It's one of those things where, like, again, where it's that irony that you see a lot in 90s pop culture, in the X-Files in particular, where mankind has tried to solve a problem, and that has, in its own way, created more problems. So we create conspiracy theories to help explain that the world doesn't make sense. But then those conspiracy theories end up, like, breaking into reality and fracturing our sense of reality, and arguably damaging the fabric of civil society as a whole by making it difficult for human beings to, like, relate to, like, consensus reality. So, like, I kind of... Again, it's chaos and it's beautiful. It's everything that you said. I agree entirely with what you said. Chaotic, randomness, beauty, horror, fantastic. Love this stuff so much.
Hey, this is Joe Harris, writer of the X-Files comics. You're listening to the X-Cast.
Let's talk then about Trepanning Opera, which is the 7th issue of this run. After Firebird being issues 4, 5, and 6, and this is a different story. It's a one-shot story that is very, very much sets its stall out with declaring that Mulder and Scully are dead, and having this, you know, this voiceover almost from the killer, and this is
to be clear, like, listeners, like, if you haven't read the story, Tony's not exaggerating. The first 7 words of this story are, "Now that you're dead, comma, Mulder and Scully." And it continues, as dead as the trees in December. Just in case you don't get... That's literally the first text box that you see. So if you have not read these comics, Tony is not exaggerating.
No, again, it just goes straight into a story that has... you mentioned Millennium earlier. There's a little bit of Millennium in Trepanning Opera, definitely. Because it has some really weird... It has some really weird deaths. It has an ostensible serial killer
who's being controlled and manipulated and pointed in direction of the lead character. Like it's arguably like prefiguring the season finale of a spin-off from the X-Files that does not exist at this moment in time, which is insane.
Yeah, exactly. And you've got the FBI looking into these series of deaths, and you've got Skinner I think this is the first time we've seen Skinner in these comics. I might be wrong, Darren.
Did he not appear in A Little Dream of Me?
In the last one. Did he? Oh, he might have done. Okay, he might have done, actually. If you're listening to them in sequence, guys, and there is a bit of a gap. So yeah, Skinner's in here, and I quite enjoyed the fact that this touches a little bit on Mulder's expertise in violent crimes. And Skinner's there saying, he is an expert in psychology and murder and all this kind of thing, and then cut to Mulder talking about trepanation and the ancient mystery. I love that.
and to be clear, and again, this is one of those small structural things with comic books that's worth acknowledging, because comic books are an art form unto themselves. It's worth noting how Petrucca and Adlard kind of structure this, where at the bottom of so there's 2 pages. So generally, so that the comic book opens with a brief introduction that doesn't feature Mulder and Scully. It has the kind of ominous voiceover. Somebody finds a dead body. We get to the second set of 2 pages in the comic. It's in the FBI headquarters. Skinner is introducing Mulder. The other agents are not having any of it. At the bottom of the page, and this is a 2-page, so you can't see what's coming on the next page. At the bottom of this page, you read Skinner saying, Agent Mulder's area of expertise is psychology. While I don't agree with all his conclusions, his theory does provide us with a working model. I think, therefore, we should hear him out. Now, you, as a reader, lick your finger and your thumb, you go to the bottom of the page, and you turn it over, and at the top of the next double-page spread, Mulder is doing one of his trademark PowerPoint presentations, opening, as you said, the first word in the top left-hand corner of the page is trepanation, which is just again, it's a really small thing, but it's a really great example of Petrucca and Adlard understanding that they're writing comic books and not making a movie or a TV show, where you can do something like that, where you can have basically a Gilligan cut in the page turn for the reader, which is just fantastic. I really love that, and it's a nice formal thing as well. Because you can tell that, like Mulder being a violent crimes expert, and I think that was a way into several stories in the first season, if I recall as well. I think, was it there in Lazarus? It was probably there in Ghost in the Machine as well. A lot of those early kind of, or maybe Born Again, Young at Heart, that sort of stuff. All those episodes about reincarnated serial killers. I can't get them all straight in my head. It's been that long since I watched them. But you have the device in the early first season of, well, we've got a violent crime. Mulder used to work in violent crime. Therefore, that's a gateway into the X-Files. And I love that Petrucca's I'm going to take that device and I'm going to apply it to this story. And also, as you said, you then get a Mulder PowerPoint presentation, which is another kind of example of one of those great X-Files kind of exposition devices. And you can tell that, again, Petrucca and Adlard are just kind of thrilled to do it. Again, they have Mulder with his pointer in front of the board. It's it's one of those things where you can tell that everybody working in this comic was, we get to play with the X-Files stuff. Let's play with the X-Files stuff. I really, really enjoy it.
Yeah, totally. And just to cut into that image of him doing that, but standing next to a Mayan's a Mayan artifact face, and it's it is very good. And it is that
it's somehow more effective than having Skinner say turn off the lights and having Mulder warm up the projector.
Yeah.
You just go straight from Skinner saying, now let's hear him out, to Mulder saying trepanation. It's trepanation.
Yeah, trepanation. And fusing that combination of You know, fusing the extreme ideas, you know, about LSD trips and psychic abilities that people are trying to tap into by doing this, with the really cold-blooded reality of murder, you know, and then him and Scully both being named in these ciphers by the killer. You know, there really is a touch of Millennium. There's a touch of like Zodiac. There is a little touch of all of these kind of inspirations brewing in something like Trepanning Opera, but mixed with a little
Red
bit
Dragon,
of
Silence of the Lambs, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
but
then you throw
the
a little
the Thomas Harris stuff that
Yeah, totally. But then throw in a little bit of Via Negativa, you know, later in there, you know, from season 8. That kind of, you know, that kind of wacky.
And in 22 pages,
Yeah.
There's a reason this comic starts with, "Now that you're dead, Mulder and Scully." It's like this starts at 11 and kind of accelerates somehow, which is kind of amazing. It's kind of something, again, very comic booky. It's very B-movie-ish. You would never get away with this on television. I think, like, maybe if you were like Brian Fuller making Hannibal, you might get away with something like this. But I cannot imagine a like primetime 90s television show doing this and it not being a disaster, which is, again, a testament to, we're writing comics, you might as well lean into it. I really, really like that about it.
Yeah, me too. And in this, if the last issue, the last story, Firebird, was much more of that kind of B-movie idea writ large, this is more brooding. I think this issue, it's more brooding. It's, you know, there's quite a bit of, particularly when Mulder's, you know, on the hunt for clues. There's a real gothic sort of shadowy aesthetic to the panels. You know, when he meets, I think it's meant to be Deep Throat, who gives him a clue. It looks like it's Deep Throat. I couldn't quite tell from I don't know if you can clarify this, Darren, or if it's somebody else. But he gets a bit of information.
I think this is meant to be the same informant. Yeah, I think this is meant to be, didn't he have a new informant in A Dream of Me, who, again, you get the sense that it was meant to be Deep Throat, but then they killed Deep Throat in the Erlenmeyer flask. So it's like, and we hadn't introduced Mr. X by the time you were writing these episodes. So it's like, Mulder, I believe, has an informant who is like specific to the comic books. Much like he has a conspiracy that is specific to the comic books. That's what I think is going on here. Yeah, that makes sense. Because he's Deep Throat-esque without being exactly Deep Throat. But it's the same idea. You know, you've got real shadow and it plays with light in those sequences. And it's I mean, this story has got, in a way, it's got two twists, because it has the reveal of who the killer is, which is a twist in itself. It's a bit mad. Yes.
But then the manner in... and I love the ending, where Scully... It seems like it's Scully plunging into this abyss at the end. But then it flips around on that. But it leaves you with the lingering, you know... Maybe you are in a dream. Maybe you're on a different... There is different planes of reality going on. And I think it's fantastic. Visually, there are some really creeping, spooky panels in this story, I think.
Yeah, I mean, like, this is probably... We haven't talked that much about Charles Adlard as an artist. And again, like, Adlard is one of the greats. He's probably best known for co-creating The Walking Dead with Robert Kirkman, and therefore never having to work ever again in his life, which good for him. But he is a kind of an artist who's probably best known for this atmospheric stuff. He has this kind of, again, he's a horror artist. And I think this is something that we'll talk about, like, when we get to the later comics, where... as the comic book goes on, you start seeing a push more towards likenesses. In particular, I think it's Gordon Purcell is the artist who kind of comes in and works with, I think, is it John Rossum, when they take over the book after Petrucca leaves. And that there's a push there towards getting the characters to look more like they do on screen. I think... Is it After Flight, I think, is the name of the graphic novel that Petrucca worked on, that came out like a year after he left the book. And it came out a year after he left the book because they kept telling artist Jill Thompson to redraw the faces so that they looked more like Gillian Anderson and David Duchovny. And I think that, like, what really works here is that Adlard, as you said, he's doing this rich, evocative kind of atmospheric stuff. Like, there's a lot of black negative space in these compositions and these panels, which is striking. It's again very much about creating mood and atmosphere. There's a wonderful little wide panel where, you mentioned when he meets his informant, and again, it's very Deep Throat-esque. There's lots of shadows. They're standing in silhouette. It's like film noir. You have, like, again, heavy ink on the black background. You've got lots of blues to give it kind of a nighttime feel, and you've got little bits of yellow to suggest, like, light piercing through it. And, like, there's just this shot of the informant walking away and Mulder against this city backdrop, which is just this vast black sky with little specks of blue to represent skyscrapers on it. And again, it's all very moody, very atmospheric. It's something where you could almost get rid of the dialogue. You could, if you were just following the story visually, it would work. And again, it kind of fits with a large part of, like, what I associate with the X-Files, which is this use of darkness. I mean, when we talk about the show, about how important the way the show looked was, how important the directors were, how important the cinematography was to making the show feel different from so much of the television landscape around it. And I like that the comic, like, has appropriated and kind of leaned into that, where this really does seem like, again, very rich, very textured, very atmospheric, and just really, really striking. I do have some problems with Trepanning Opera. I think that perhaps it tries to cram too much into, like, 22 pages. I feel it's perhaps a little ambitious, particularly, like, coming off the back of, like, Firebird, where you have this sprawling 3-issue epic, and it feels gigantic and massive. And again, like, we want to talk about larger comic book trends as you get towards the turn of the millennium, and, like, you'll notice yourself as we get to, when we cover, like, you've read the IDW comics, those tend to have longer arcs. Those tend to have arcs that spread across multiple issues. Even standalone stories tend to be two-parters as opposed to single-issue stories. Single-issue stories are the exception rather than the rule. And, like, again, there's an argument about decompression in comic books and whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. Whether or not you should be able to tell a single story in a single issue, or whether or not you get more by stretching it out across 3, 4, 5, or 6, or whether that's a cynical gambit to get people to pay for 3, 4, or 5, or 6 issues. But I do think that, like, Trepanning Opera maybe, while it's a great read, I really enjoy it. I actually like it a lot. I think that there's maybe one or two elements that maybe cloud it a little bit. Like, for example, you mentioned that this is a standalone story, and it kind of is. It's largely disconnected from, it's not a direct follow-on from Firebird, but it does also have this sense of, but maybe it is actually connected to this conspiracy that we're dealing with, where, like, the killer has been sent after Mulder. He's been targeted at Mulder. So there's a sense that this is part of a larger story that is taking place as well. And again, even when Mulder is meeting with his informant, and again, nice comic book convention here, you have him say that, oh, well, by the way, 2 of the victims from an earlier case were killed with 1 bullet to the forehead right in the third eye, which is a reference to a dismemberance of things past. And I love that you get the comic book thing of the little box that tells you, by the way, see X-Files number 2 for more details of this. And I do, like, that's the thing, is where I almost feel like this would work better if it was completely standalone. There's a point where, as you get towards the end of it, where it's like, oh no, this is a big reveal, it's all one story, it's all one gigantic epic that's unfolding, where I think this maybe suffers a little bit from that, but that's really my only complaint about a story that I otherwise really, really, really like.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. It's always the balance, isn't it, of getting, how much do you cram into a story. I think this could have done with maybe being two issues. I think you could have got a bit more out of it then. But that being said, it really packs it in. It's a bit of a ride. Oh, yeah. And
there's no wasted panel. Like, forget a wasted page. There's no wasted panel here.
Absolutely not. No. And what do you make of the ending though? Because the ending is deliberately trippy. The ending is designed in order to make, to leave it open as to whether Scully has plunged into the abyss or not. I mean, do you think it's intentionally designed to try? I mean, obviously we know that's not happened, but is it intentionally one of those open-ended X-Files endings? that the show loved to do that much.
The monster got away. The monster's still out there. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing, is that like it is very much in that tradition of like, oh, but Flukeman is out there somewhere waiting, but we're never going to deal with it again kind of endings. And part of me also just kind of like wants to live in the universe where Carter reads the comic and is so moved by it that all of a sudden, midway through season 3, he's like, oh, by the way, Scully's not here anymore because she died in a comic book that nobody read. And like just kind of commits to that. But I kind of give that ending credit, and I actually really like that ending because, again, it ties into this theme that we mentioned. Like it came up in Firebird. It's very, very strong here. It's this question of like, what is reality? What is real and what is fake? Like, you have this idea that the serial killer, was brought into being. Life is but a dream because I was invented. That sort of thing. He sees himself as somebody who was conjured out of nothingness. Now, in reality, there's a suggestion that he was abused by his father, and he had this near-death experience, and both of these radically altered the course of his life. But there is this sense that he believes he is a made-up man, and he believes that his experience of reality is not the same as anybody else's reality, but is truer. And you have this... And again, this is the thing where... if you wanted to be cynical about it, you could say that this is just, Petrucca proving how smart he is, or some sort of dismissive comment like that. But you have the idea running through these comics, again, that Petrucca understands that these comics are never going to be, quote, X-Files Prime, unquote. They're never going to be the driving force of the X-Files. At best, they'll probably end up being remembered, as we're talking about them now, as this kind of footnote in the franchise history, this kind of evolutionary dead end, which is fascinating and full of brilliant stories that I love and adore, but which maybe doesn't connect that firmly to anything else that ever happens. And so you have this question of, like, what is reality becomes a way of, and again, metaphorically and metaphysically, dealing with the fact that these stories in these comic books maybe don't matter in the sense of being continuity. These stories may all be discontinuity. There's that great quote from, again, Alan Moore when he's writing, is it Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow? This is an imaginary story, but then again, aren't they all? Where, you have Mulder asking Scully if she's sure that the reality in which she survived is real, or if this is just a waking dream that she experiences as she falls to her death, and whether or not that the difference between the two is in any way quantifiable, or if it actually matters in any material sense. But it's also kind of Petrucca and Adlard meditating on the comic book itself, which is like, this comic book probably doesn't matter in any inverted commas sense. It's never going to be referenced by the show. It's never going to be part of the canon. It's never going to explain anything that happens on television to David Duchovny or Gillian Anderson. And I think it's again, not to put too much emphasis on this, and not to kind of like, not to get kind of too pretentious, but it is worth noting that the final sequence where the image of the killer falling is reversed, where instead it's Scully falling, she's falling into a vast white void. She's not falling into darkness. She's falling into a blank page. It's almost as if she's being undone. She's a comic book character who is being erased. And it kind of... obviously, it ties into all this stuff that's happening in pop culture at the moment. And again, I mentioned writers like Grant Morrison, who's working on... I think Morrison is writing on The Invisibles at this point in time, and The Invisibles goes on to be a touchstone for the Matrix movies. This idea of, is your reality actual reality? But it also feels like Petrucca's going, yeah, but even within the understanding that The X-Files is obviously a television show, it's not real. These comics are extra not real, because they're a comic book spin-off from a TV show. There are degrees of unreality, and these characters that I'm writing at this moment in time exist at an extra level of abstraction, where they are, Mulder and Scully are not real in the television show, but these characters in these comics may not even be real relative to the versions who are not real in the television show. And I like that, again, at the risk of sounding like dorm room bong-smoking philosophy existential meditation 101, the comic kind of leans into the psychedelia of that, which is like, does that matter? And does that, is there any difference between an abstraction of an abstraction of an abstraction of Scully and the sense that you as a reader may not know that what you're experiencing is real. So I kind of give that, as you point out, the monster is still out there, or did Scully really escape ending, the benefit of the doubt, because it works thematically, logically, and it fits with the larger pattern of, I think, what Petrucca's doing with these comics. So yeah, no, I really like the ending, actually.
Yeah. Me too. It's really evocative. It's a lot of fun. And that's the thing. That's the thing with these comics. They're interesting. They're challenging. They have a lot of ideas. They're fun. They're particularly these two kind of stories. They're very pulpy in many ways, and they're a different register. They're a different register to what we're seeing on screen, and I think that's why they're so there. And they've aged so well. I mean, I'm sure this will be something we say throughout these podcasts going through them. They've really aged well. The artwork's fantastic. The writing is vivid and interesting, and there's a tongue in cheek to it all. Yeah, I think they're great fun, and it's continuing fun to be going through these. And I am really looking forward to seeing what's coming down the pipe.
And before we go, just quickly, I should shout out, if you are reading along at home, it's worth noting that there's a whole bunch of again. Petrucca and Adlard were phenomenal in terms of just being prolific. They did a phenomenal amount of work on the comics. And if you are reading, IDW put out these wonderful hardcover collections that are available digitally as well if you want to read them. But it's worth noting that even those collections don't cover all of the work that Petrucca and Adlard did. They were also doing things like Trick of the Light, which was a 12-issue mini-comic that was published, I believe, in an issue of a Hype magazine, was it? I believe it was Hero Illustrated magazine. And they did a kind of an annual called Hollow Eve as well, which is arguably the most Scully-focused story I think that Petrucca's ever written. That's Hollow Eve. Which is very much a sequel to the first season episode Eve as well. Those aren't available in collected editions from IDW, so you'll have to actually, if you want to find those, you have to go to back issues. But I would recommend checking out Hollow Eve at least if you get the chance. But yeah, just acknowledging the fact that they were doing so much with this license, with these characters, and really just having fun with them, which is just infectious, particularly when we get to an age where people are very precious about kind of tie-in media, where people are very sensitive, where comic books are kind of cancelled and kind of where everything has to line up and make sense and fit with a 10-year plan that a company has for particular characters or for particular concepts. I like how freewheeling these comics are, and I find that joyous and infectious. So I'm really glad to be revisiting these. Thank you so much for the invitation, Tony.
Oh no, you're welcome. You're welcome. It's great to be chatting through these with you, and I hope people will be picking these up and re-engaging with them, because they are available, and you can, as Darren has just described, find them in different places. So yeah, it's going to be great fun. I think actually it's my error. I think we might have missed a Little Dream of Me, actually, which we probably should have covered before Firebird. So we'll come back and we'll do that one at some point as part of one of our next.
Did we not do that? Do we not? That's no. The Samantha Mulder one. Do we not do that? We didn't do that one.
I don't think we did.
So
we're out of continuity, Darren. Oh no. What's going to happen?
I feel really bad because now I'm referencing all the points I made about the return. So now I have to remember all the points that I said that I made about the return in this.
Yeah. It's all getting very complicated. It's all going very complicated. That's my error. But we'll come back to it. We'll do it in the next episode
retcon.
When we do a couple of others. Yeah. But it'll all be good. But until we do return for another episode, Darren, why don't you let people know what you're up to? You've always got a lot of plates spinning. So why don't you point people towards where they can find you and what you're up to?
All right, so I co-host a podcast called The 250 with my good friend Andrew Quinn. Andrew has recently gone off and gotten married. He's currently on his honeymoon. We managed to bank some episodes ahead of time, so we are releasing those as we go. Congratulations. It was a really great wedding. I was very thrilled to be there. His wife is fantastic. They are perfectly matched for one another. It's just really great when nice people end up with nice people. It is really lovely.
Yeah.
And I love them both very, very much. But so that is what I plug. I plug nice people getting with nice people. That's what I recommend. No, the podcast that I co-host, the 250 with him, we have banked a couple of episodes ahead of time. So we'll be releasing, if this is coming out to Patreons, We will have covered Train Spotting last weekend with the wonderful Emma Kiley, and next weekend we'll be doing T2 Train Spotting, the sequel to Train Spotting, or as Andrew calls it, T2 Junkment Day, with Emma Kiley joining us and also Jason Coyle joining us as well. So that's great fun. You can listen there as well. If you are listening as a regular listener, we have some great stuff planned for later in the summer. We are going to be doing a season of Jaws specials covering for Shark Week. Emma will be rejoining us for those, and we'll have a host of special guests. We're hoping to release 4 episodes in the space of a week. I don't know if we're ever going to actually do that, but that was Andrew's idea, and I guess we kind of have committed to it now. If you're interested in checking out some of the stuff I do, I write at The Escapist every Monday and Friday. I publish an In the Frame column. Every second Monday, I'm doing a video. We're bringing back the video In the Frame, edited by the wonderful Omar Ahmed, who is just fantastic. So recently, for example, we will have covered Star Trek, why Star Trek is stuck in the past for a franchise that should be looking to the future, the visual storytelling of Better Call Saul, and the way in which Moon Knight approaches Marvel's long-standing villain problem. If by the time this comes out, we will have probably released an episode covering Star Wars, in particular, the question of whether or not Disney is learning the right lessons from its creative failures within the franchise. And outside of that, follow me on Twitter. I'm at Darren_Mooney. And I should actually plug this. I have a book coming out, part of the Black Archive series published by Obverse Books, looking at Doctor Who stories. I managed to convince them to let me talk about Kill the Moon. So if you are a fan of Doctor Who, or if you know somebody who is, please feel free to pick up a copy of Kill the Moon, The Black Archives, written by Darren Mooney. I'm very proud of it. I think it's a good book. I think it holds up very, very well. And I'm just thrilled that I had the chance to do it. So that's my massive plug. Apologies for all that, Tony.
No, fair enough. Plug away, absolutely. And you can find me at AJ Blackwriter on Twitter, and check out my website, culturalconversation.co.uk, for all the links to podcasts, books, writing, etc., etc. And, generally, I'm knocking about all over the We Made This podcast network, at We Made This, at We_made this on Twitter, We Made This on Facebook, and We Made This pod on Instagram. And, you can obviously remember to follow the Xcast, the X_cast on Twitter. And we're also on Facebook as well and on Instagram. So do check us out over there, and you'll get all that in the credits as well. But yeah, thanks, Darren. We'll be back for another Tops relatively soon. I think we're going to cover a few different issues. We've got Silent Cities of the Mind coming next, which is going to be a big one. We'll also do The Return as well. And maybe I think Feelings of Unreality is another one that's coming up very soon as well. So maybe we'll throw all those into the mix next time. But
Feelings of Unreality is very much the climax, the kind of the opening year of this comic book. So it's interesting.
That's cool. We got a lot coming. We got a lot coming down the pipe. So we're gonna have some fun with those coming very soon. So hopefully you're enjoying these, guys. And remember, until then, we're part of, as I say, the We Made This podcast network. Do give us a rating, the Xcast on Apple Podcasts. Give us a rating review. That would help us massively. Get even more known, even though we're pretty well known amongst X-Files podcasts by now. But it keep us getting even more well known. And if you want to help the network out, which I've mentioned, please give us a little bit of... please throw money at us on Patreon at patreon.com/We Made This. That will help us massively. But... The X-Files and Tops Comics is not all we're discussing, so we'll give you a taste of what else you might have missed on the network in just a moment. Until then, as always, remember, trust no one.
Elsewhere on We Made This.
Make it so. A Star Trek Picard podcast.
Why? Why do you even need to bring that up? You don't. We've done a story, and you're just using that for the. No, it's like, no, I don't get it. I understand it. I understand Soongs. Soongs are always going to be in some way related to the Kang story because of genetics and the stuff like that they've done. I get it, but to do that, and if it comes in season 3, if it's a main thing in season 3, then I'll hold judgment. If it doesn't get mentioned in season 3, then what was the point?
Pick a disc.
Guardian reading lefty, which a
bleeding heart is one of the phrases we use a lot here in the US. Like, he cares about the homeless. I'm sort of shifting into my Limbaugh impersonation. Oh, he wants to house the homeless. What is he, a communist? Like, that's not maybe a little, but he's concerned with this. He's concerned with climate change. He's concerned with poverty. He's concerned with just general treatment of your fellow human beings. Like, I'm sure he resents having been subjected to trauma in his own life, and that gives him a great deal of sympathy, which I think is a good quality.
Third one, are the following names of hops, US space shuttles, or both?
Brilliant.
First one, Atlantis.
No, it's a US space shuttle, but is it a hop? I'm going to say it's just a US space shuttle.
Correct.
Good.
I didn't.
Have I got to get best of three again?
Yeah, I didn't know that was a space shuttle. Well, that's my poor knowledge, that is. Second one, Galaxy.
I know that that's a hop because I've seen it in a pub recently. I don't know if it's a space shuttle, so I'm going to say both.
Just a hop, that one.
Oh, damn it.
Next one, Endeavour.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. The X-Cast and X-Files podcast was created by Tony Black and is produced and hosted by Carl Sweeney, Sarah Blair and Kurt North.
You can find the podcast on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the X-Cast, and in our group, X-Files Basement, the X-Cast podcast fan group, and on Instagram at the X-Cast pod.
Don't forget, you can support the show by becoming a member on Patreon. Our patrons get early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes chats with our hosts and a thriving community of X-Files, and other premium interviews and specials. To find out more and subscribe, you can go to patreon.com/thexcast. That's patreon.com/thexcast.
We are also part of the We Made This podcast network, full of popular culture shows, including our Millennium series, The Time Is Now. You can find all of our shows at our website, wemadethispod.com, or via Twitter at wemadethispod.
Thanks for listening and keep watching the skies.